This special education teacher was already facing serious prison time, accused of sexually abusing more than one student. But now we've learned there's a new alleged victim in this case, just a freshman who police say Nadia Horn also allegedly preyed on. We have the explosive new court documents, and just wait until I show you what this teacher allegedly sent this young victim on TikTok. We're on the case, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Stewart. The case against Nadia Horn, a teacher from Eau Claire, Wisconsin, just went to a new level. We've been covering this case for the past 3 months, and now we're learning that police believe that there is an alleged third victim who is also a student in this case. And as we lay out for you the allegations facing this teacher that could put her in prison for a very long time, you're going to start to see a pattern that's playing out in how police believe Horn allegedly groomed and courted these young victims. So let's get into this case. Nadia Horn is 22 years old, and she was a teacher at North High School in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, which is a town that's not too far from Minnesota. And at North High School, she had multiple positions, it appears. She was a special education teacher, and she was also an assistant coach on the boys basketball team, according to court records. Now, for as much as you see on social media that she was smiling, she actually had gone to North High School herself. She graduated in 2021. You take a look at this mugshot. This is from her arrest in March, and that really tells you a story of her potentially realizing how much trouble she may be in. And this mugshot was taken before the new allegations this week, so her situation appears to have gotten even more serious. Now, in the spring, Horn was arrested, and this was the last time we talked about this case, when she was accused of sexually abusing 2 students at her school. This third victim, again, also allegedly a student at the school where she was working. Now, this third victim was discovered because police say they filed a search warrant with TikTok, and the information came back, and it showed some very graphic messages that Horn allegedly sent this boy. So let's talk about the investigation here. And that's when police were notified of some odd behavior by Horn at North High School. And this is not an investigation at this point in time that was looking at any sort of sex crime. It was just seen as the line being blurred between student and teacher, because Horn had allegedly bought a student a cell phone, and she was seen driving this student around town. And Horn also had reportedly asked the boy to add her on Snapchat, and she also asked him to hang out outside of school and to go get food. Interesting thing with this is, for as much as it seems like Horn was the one really reaching out to this student, it appears the boy didn't really know how to feel about it, because according to court records, he said he found her behavior to be odd and weird. Now, at some point in time, that odd behavior did become allegedly sexual and criminal. The student told police that Horn would send him, quote, really revealing pictures. He said they weren't nude pictures, but they were just revealing. She allegedly sent messages saying that seeing the student in school made her body feel a certain way. Now, as of this week, there are now 3 alleged victims of this teacher, and all of them were students at the school where she taught. So let's go through each victim and what Nadia Horn's accused of. So the first victim, identified as victim 1 in court records, goes back to January. Horn reportedly brought the student to her place, and they watched television. The student was 16 years old at the time, according to court records. Now, the criminal complaint alleges, quote, Horn continually got closer to him. Victim 1 reported that Horn began laying on him and that he felt trapped. Victim 1 reported that Horn is his second hour and Husky time teacher, which is kind of like a homeroom at this high school. Husky is their mascot. Victim 1 stated that they did, quote, everything sexual you can do with a person. Victim 1 reported this happened almost every time he went to Horn's apartment. Victim 1 reported that the last time this happened was around 3 to 4 weeks ago. Victim 1 stated all the sexual activity happened in Horn's bedroom. Now, the student allegedly showed the police pictures from inside Horn's apartment. And this is obviously very concerning, alleged behavior, and it certainly would come with serious criminal charges on its own. But the student that we're talking about, that's only the first victim, allegedly in this case. Victim number 2 was a student who was 16 years old. And victim number 2 spoke with the first victim, and they allegedly said that they had similar experiences with Nadia Horn. The first victim claimed that Horn sent him a Snapchat message around 10:30 p.m. on March 24th, which is a Tuesday, asking him to come over. Horn allegedly said something to the effect of, "I shouldn't be asking you this, but will you come over?" Now, the timeline alleges that Horn was sexually abusing multiple students all around the same time this year. As far as the student identified as victim number 2, he was 16 at the time of the abuse, and Horn allegedly admitted to authorities that she had sex with him roughly a week before her arrest, which happened in late March. She allegedly brought victim 2 to her apartment to give him a ride somewhere, which is a similar pattern to other victims that we're seeing in this case. Now, when Horn was confronted by the police, the criminal complaint alleges a very disturbing line that Horn told them. She reportedly told investigators that victim 2, quote, really wanted it. She also allegedly said, quote, that the first occasion she had intercourse with victim 2, victim 1 was also present. Now, if those allegations are true, Horn is looking at decades in prison. She initially faced charges of second-degree sexual assault of a child, 2 counts of child enticement, and sexual assault by a person who works or volunteers with children. And that was before the digital forensics came back on her phone. Police say they found messages Horn sent a 15-year-old freshman that revealed that she allegedly abused a 3rd student. That student was a member of the boys' basketball team, Horn, an assistant coach. The boy said that Horn was, quote, too friendly, and she shared a lot about her life with students. Police allege that Horn sexually abused this student multiple times between March 1st and March 25th, which was the day of her arrest, 5 days after police started investigating that odd behavior. And that is all within the same time frame as the other alleged victims in this case. Now, police say they filed a search warrant with TikTok, and these are the messages that the app says Horn sent this boy. You have March 10th, where she sends, quote, well, damn, with a smiley face emoji. Then you have March 14th, and she says, my FYP so good, I shouldn't want you as bad as I do. I'm not really sure what FYP means, but on TikTok, it typically means For You page. Then the next day, March 15th, 10:38 p.m., quote, gosh, I hope you know how much I crave you every second. 2 minutes later, you know how much I'm going to want you every time I see you now. Then a couple minutes after that, expletive, baby, the things I'd do. March 16th, this is 11:36 in the morning. Baby, need you bad. And it's important to note that that is a Monday during school hours when authorities believe that she was working that day and the student was in school. Also during school hours, she makes reference to her private area in a message that is far too graphic and frankly cringeworthy to say here. Then a couple minutes after that, she allegedly says, quote, yeah, it's never been just one part. She also messages all of me around that time on Monday, March 16th. Now, the messages that are laid out in the criminal complaint are all allegedly from Horn. They don't show how the victim replied to her in this conversation. And in several messages, police do note that Horn allegedly uses this victim's name, which will show that she knew exactly who she was allegedly talking to. In another message that is also potentially damning from a legal perspective, she makes reference to the boy being in high school. On March 14th, she messaged the boy, there's not a lot of high schoolers that know High School Musical, but I'm glad you do. And victim 3 allegedly replies, yes, ma'am. Now, sadly, this alleged abuse went beyond just messages on TikTok. Police say they can see on TikTok that there were videos and images that were exchanged between Horn and victim 3, but it is unclear what those are. Now, initially, police say that victim 3 denied that Horn sexually abused him, but then later, he told authorities that Horn did send him explicit images, and she allegedly performed sex acts over a video call. The victim also says that Horn came to his house, she brought him food, she allegedly sexually abused him after his mom went to sleep. She also says that on another 2 occasions, Horn abused him in her vehicle. And then there's a 4th instance when Horn allegedly sexually abused him at her home roughly 5 days before her arrest. Horn is now facing additional charges in connection to this victim of repeated sexual assault of a child, use of a computer to facilitate a sex crime, and now a third count of child enticement. In the previous criminal complaint, police say that Horn made several disturbing statements when they confronted her at her home on March 25th. And this is when authorities thought there were only 2 alleged victims in this case. Police say when they went to Horn's house, they asked if she knew why they were there. And she said, quote, "Yeah, school stuff." She said that she had picked up students from a party and she had brought them home, and that was a mistake. Horn allegedly admitted to buying victim 1 an iPhone 14, and she said that she reportedly did that just to help him out. She claims that she got close to victim 1 because he needed support. She also said she gave him, quote, "food and stuff." But then police got more specific about why they were investigating Nadia Horn. And they asked her about allegations of her having sex with these students. And Horn allegedly admitted to having sex with victim 1 3 times. She also admitted on the day that she spoke with investigators to allegedly sending a selfie to the victim that morning. Police write, quote, "Horn was asked if she recalled the picture being of a pillow and saying something similar to 'there's room for you here,' to which Horn allegedly replied, 'Oh yeah, shouldn't have said yeah.' Then, when she was asked if she sent nude photos to the victim, she responded, quote, 'potentially.' Horn also reportedly told investigators, quote, 'it just felt mutual,' and she didn't feel like she was taking advantage of the victims. She also allegedly gave the boys wine at her apartment because she says they asked for it. Now, here's Horn making her first court appearance. This is per WEAU television in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. The judge initially set her bond at $15,000, and Horn posted that, and she was out of jail as this case moves forward. She has a new court hearing set in the wake of these new charges, and she is next due in court for an initial appearance on those charges on July 28th. Joining me now to talk about this case once again is former sex crimes prosecutor Dan Shore. Always great to have you here on Law and Crime. We talked about this case back in April, I think right after her arrest. What do you make of what she's now accused of with this alleged third victim?
Well, we had talked previously about how in a lot of cases there are more than 1 or 2 victims. Once you see some kind of misconduct with underage people, sometimes then other people come out. But one thing that's pretty alarming from the charging document, the criminal complaint, is just how the messages between this defendant and a 9th grader were so explicit, where she acknowledged that they were engaging in sexual activity. She said how she wanted him sexually. She referred to him as a high school student. So if these messages are authentic, which there's no reason to believe they're not, it was not only extremely clear what was happening, it was also extremely reckless of her to put all that in writing. And we've seen that in a lot of cases, and people often wonder, why do people put these things in writing? And that's another component of it that seems like there was a real problem, that she thought that this was okay, that she could message like that with a 9th grader and get away with it.
Yeah, and I think, one of the other victims was roughly 16, 17 years old. Not that, that makes, too much of a difference. But the fact that now you're dealing with someone who is under the age of 16, she is 22, so she's not like an older teacher. But how does the age difference in this kind of play into potentially, how a jury could look at this going forward? Because when I think of someone who's 17, and you could say, oh, they're only just a couple of years apart. I mean, when you're 15 and you're talking about a teacher sending these messages to a freshman, it is very, very difficult to read.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to help her with a jury, because the age difference is clearly an age difference that's not only numerically it's a few years, but it's a significant time period in someone's life for development, maturity.
Yeah.
Talking about someone in 9th grade, then you're talking about an adult who's in their 20s. So the law is designed to prevent that from being legal. So I don't think a jury will be sympathetic to that. And there's just the egregiousness, the explicitness of what she wrote in these messages allegedly. I don't think there's going to be a lot of sympathy just because she's in her early 20s versus someone who's in their 30s or 40s.
Well, and I think too, like what stood out to me across the board is it's just she's the one who's initiated so much of what's been alleged, even before it gets sexual, where the third victim in this new criminal complaint, says something along the lines that she was just like oversharing a lot about her life, and here's a freshman who, you talk about like an age of maturity. A lot of times people, coming out of middle school, like no filter or anything of that, like even to him, it was to the point of like, this is a lot. And then you had victim number one who found it odd and weird the way that she was,
Mhm.
buying him things and taking him around town. What do you make of I guess the patterns that stand out to you across the board with these three alleged victims, and how this teacher allegedly, really kind of began the grooming process, it seems like, with them?
Yeah, and we see these themes in a lot of cases where there's an older teacher or an older person with an underage person that very rarely does in the case of with teachers, and we see a lot of cases with teachers, rarely does someone just come out and say something sexually explicit and try to engage in sexual interactions. Usually there's a bonding process, a grooming process, as you said, where not only is trust gained from the person who ultimately experiences sexual abuse, but there's also a period of kind of what we call boundary probing, where someone says, "Oh, can I get away with this? Can I get away with this?" And it becomes more and more over time. And then with messaging now on different apps, it makes it easier for a teacher to have access to a student outside of school hours, where they can message each other and share photos and videos, as was done here, and sexually explicit comments before sexual activity actually happens. So before we had that kind of online world, it was teachers didn't have access to do that kind of interactions, but now we do. And that's why when I'm doing trainings with schools, I'm always saying that it should be banned for teachers to have any communication with students outside school platforms, and certainly outside school hours, unless it's really clearly about an assignment. Because the other activity that may not seem egregious is often the boundary probing grooming that leads to sex abuse.
Well, and I think too about like, certainly not having that communication outside of school hours, but a couple of these explicit messages that were allegedly sent on TikTok, she sent during school hours. One is on a Monday around like 11:30 in the
Mm-hmm.
morning. She sent, a couple pretty explicit messages. I think it was the 16th, might have been the day in March, where she's sending these. From a civil side of things, I mean, how problematic is that potentially for the school system, knowing that this student's in class, the teacher is supposed to be working, and she is, um, sending things that you have a hard time even just reading them aloud. Doing a story like this, what could that mean for all of this, as she was doing this during school hours?
Well, the biggest liability for a school comes when they either knew or should have known about some type of misconduct and they were deliberately indifferent to what was happening. So we don't have any evidence showing that now, but usually when there's allegations like this, the school conducts an independent investigation. They usually bring in an outside investigator. That's often the work I do. I'm brought in as an independent investigator in a lot of these cases to see, well, what was known by other people. Often there are rumors in cases like this, and people saying, "Oh, I see these people who are acting inappropriately or suspiciously. Why don't we look into it?" And so, in other schools that I've investigated, sometimes you find that it was really ignored, and that allowed things to fester and escalate. So that's a big part of this, is finding out what did the school know, when did they know it. If there was really no way they could have known, then their liability would be much reduced from the school actually being in a position to stop it and ignoring it. And another part of that is also, what are the school policies to prohibit different types of interactions? And then also, when the school is having those policies, what kind of culture do they have? Is the school just putting the policies on a website and no one knows about it? Or are they actually having trainings and discussions with their personnel about proper interactions with students and how to spot other inappropriate interactions and knowing to flag it and where to flag it? That's really important also.
Yeah, it stood out to me, at least in the first criminal complaint last time we talked about it, is like the investigation into Nadia Horn began with it wasn't even really an investigation into a sex crime at that point. It was kind of just some odd behavior that she had bought this cell phone for a student, and then they had been spending time together outside. And then it's kind of started to go into, where we're talking about criminal activity. With the information that you get from a platform like TikTok, and I rarely use TikTok, so I'm not like 100%, an expert on it. But
Mm-hmm.
you get the messages and the DMs, and I know there are some apps like Snapchat's another one that's mentioned here. But in TikTok, police say they can see that messages were sent, or excuse me, images and videos were sent back and forth between the victim, and then Nadia Horn. Um, but you can't see those. Like, how does that, if you can't get those images from TikTok, but you know that they're having, she is sending explicit messages, and then a picture is sent, like, how can that be presented in building your case to try and argue that there were some explicit images that were sent. I mean, clearly, the victim in the criminal complaint does talk about some images
Yeah.
he received, but how can you actually present that as a fact that that's something that she was allegedly doing?
Sure, that's a great question. Well, first of all, you get the account of the victim who says what images he received. And then you look at the other language in the messages that surround the images, because as we've talked about, there were very explicit writings about sexual activity, wanting to have sexual activity, having had sexual activity in these messages. So if the images that you can't see are interspersed with messages that are sexually explicit and the victim says that the images were sexually explicit, then a jury might make a reasonable inference that those images are as that victim said they are. So that's how you would go about it. Can you show it conclusively? No, but it's a lot of circumstantial evidence considering what she's writing. And she has a right to remain silent. She may never testify, but if she did, she could certainly be asked, well, what were you sending? And if she says, well, it was just innocuous images interspersed with these really sexually explicit sexually explicit messages, that might be less credible.
I think with like a lot of these stories that we'll talk about, you always just sit back and you're like, how does someone get to the point where this is happening? Where someone could even get to the point where they're being accused of this. And we've seen, unfortunately, like a lot of these cases, but when you read through when police confront Nadia Horn, and it just doesn't seem like she's recognizing how much trouble that she's actually in just based off the criminal complaint. I mean, she is admitting to a lot to officers. They ask if she sent some explicit pictures. I think she responds potentially, and it just doesn't seem like, and we can only read, it's not like, we have seen body camera video of that interaction, but just what do you like, how often in these cases do people who are clearly, and she's only alleged at this point, but doing terrible, terrible things, just not even realize how awful it actually is?
Well, I think sometimes there's a lack of awareness. The fact that she was doing it at all probably shows a lack of awareness of how
Sure.
awful what she was
Yeah.
doing. And then also the fact that she was putting it so explicitly in messages shows almost a lack of a consciousness of guilt, that she's not trying to hide it, although she does things that, might be hiding it, but she's writing very explicitly in these messages. So she's putting her career and her life in the hands of this ninth grader, because that ninth grader then has the power to go to law enforcement and end her career, and also subject her to prison time, which she's facing now. So I think that, when I prosecuted homicide cases in New York City as a prosecutor, and I remember there were people who committed murders who would come in and they would confess. So I think there's sometimes people feel once they're caught that they want to unburden themselves. They want to tell somebody. They feel sometimes it hits them, maybe not the enormity of what they did, but just some people do have this need to talk once they are confronted with something. And that might have been what happened here.
She's going to be in court again. Believe it's July 28th is the date after this new criminal complaint. The new charges came down. Initially, she was released on a $15,000 bond. And I think in some ways it's like you have, a 22-year-old teacher. She had graduated this high school only in 2021. And then she's accused of inappropriate behavior with students. She's accused of sexual abuse. Like you could also frame it as like, this is someone who was preying on multiple students. If you frame it differently,
Right.
it sounds like a $15,000 bond isn't high enough. And I know we've had the conversation before where it's like you think of a like Jerry Sandusky type character who is preying on people, but then it's like you look at a Nadia Horn and there's almost like an innocence there because she's a new teacher and all of this stuff. Like when you hear that she's at, like, how does someone accused of this even be allowed out on bond on cases going forward when she's facing the possibility now of decades in prison?
Right. Well, it's important to remember that generally the point of bond is to make someone show up in court, make sure they don't flee, make sure they don't, just abscond and never come back with, to appear in court. So I think if you were a defense attorney for her, even though there's new allegations, your argument from the defense side would say she had a $15,000 bond. She has not fled the area. She's reporting back to court. The new allegations do not involve conduct that has allegedly occurred since she was out on bond. That's a significant thing. So a defense attorney would say the conditions haven't changed. The bond is to get her to come back, and she's always come back to court. So I think that argument might be persuasive. Once she is convicted, if she is convicted, sometimes people are out on bond pending sentencing, but at that point, someone has a much higher likelihood of fleeing if they're already convicted and facing definite prison time. So that might be a different situation.
And then just lastly, with this new alleged victim and any victim to come forward to talk about this with law enforcement, to admit to it, to cooperate with the investigation on like things that can be very, very concerning, potentially embarrassing, like information. I mean, obviously the name of this victim as such a young person is not going to be released from just how this could play out going forward. And there's two other victims, and it seems like they've cooperated just based off of it. But you have this victim who they didn't know about until the information came back. Like, how do you as a prosecutor handle that individual knowing that they really don't want to be in this situation? They may not want to testify if this goes to trial. They may be someone who's vulnerable to a cross-examination because it took a couple times for them to really open up about what happened. Like, I mean, how do you handle that situation if you're a prosecutor on this case?
Yeah, and I prosecute these types of cases. It's really a challenge because it's very common for victims of sex abuse not to want to testify in court, whether they're adults or children. But certainly when they're children, there's even more heightened embarrassment and fear. And I think working with them over time, and I always brought them into the courtroom before a trial to show them where everyone's going to be, to show them where the court officers are going to be. They can have other people to support them. But these are some reasons why a lot of these cases end in a plea bargain, not in trial, where if the defendant is willing to plea, and I would assume in this case some prison time would be required, then you can spare the victims and their families having to go through the ordeal of testifying, reliving it. But a lot of that depends on how powerful the evidence is and the defense position on whether they want to challenge this in court. Because the messages are so clear and explicit, I would think that that's more reason why there would be a plea bargain here, but it'll be interesting to see as it's going forward.
Yeah, we'll see what happens next. Dan Shore, former sex crimes prosecutor. Always great to talk about some really difficult cases with you. And people can find your work several places, including Substack. What do people need to know?
Sure. I write fiction, and my latest novel, Open Bar, is about sex abuse at an educational institution. So it's really on point to this. People can find Open Bar anywhere books are sold, or they can find me on Substack where I write about these issues and other issues.
All right. So, former sex crimes prosecutor Dan Shore. Always great to have you on Law&Crime. Thanks for being here.
Thanks. It's good to talk to you.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law&Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify, and we are also streaming on Peacock. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.